After World War II, the Allies held the famous Nuremberg trials, as well as lesser-known trials, such as at Dachau, for the purpose of punishing the Germans, in particular members of the Nazi Party and SS, for their genocide policies against Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, political prisoners, the clergy, even Allied POWs. Some of Germany's most notorious military and civilian leaders were tried, most convicted, and some were executed or given long prison sentences. But one man was placed on trial who had committed no comparable war crimes, Grand Admiral Karl Doenitz, who commanded Germany's submarine force. The major crime he was charged with was waging a campaign of violent and unrestricted warfare, which was, in fact, laughable, as all the nations waged submarine warfare. During the last weeks of the war, as Hitler's successor, he was charged also with ordering the continuation of the war. But Doenitz had a great defense that saved him from being executed. What was the Laconia incident? How did it affect German operations in the U-boat war during World War II? What was the result of this event?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
Submarine warfare was developed in the First World War, and the Germans proved to be very good at it. Their practice at that time was to surface and confront merchant ships, board and inspect their cargoes, then capturing or sinking the ship if it belonged to a belligerent nation. The crews were then allowed to leave the ship in lifeboats if sinking was the decision, therefore saving lives. But the British developed the Q-ship, a trawler or a merchantman disguised as such but carrying naval guns to sink the unwary U-boat when it surfaced. This forced the Imperial German Navy to abandon the rather civilized practice of giving a warning and just sinking ships on sight. The same would happen during World War II, but in a very different way. When the war broke out, Germany was very short on U-boats, but on 24 September, orders were issued that, once a ship was contacted to be inspected, it could be sunk if it radioed the position of the German submarine as being a hostile act. The Royal Navy had received orders for all ships, regardless of status, to report any U-boat sightings, even if contacted by the enemy. The stage was set. On 29 October 1939, permission was granted to attack passenger ships when sailing under destroyer escort, and not until 17 November could armed passenger liners be attacked. These orders were issued at a time when the British Expeditionary Force was crossing to the continent to reinforce France. The specter of another campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare was looming. Early in 1940, Standing Order 154 went to the U-boats. Do not pick up survivors and take them with you. Do not worry about the merchant ship's boats. Weather conditions and the distance to land play no part. Have a care only for your own ship and think only to attain your next success as soon as possible. We must be harsh in this war. The enemy began the war in order to destroy us, so nothing else matters. Signed, Doenitz. Both Doenitz and his witnesses made much of the point that this was purely a no-rescue order, necessary to prevent young U-boat captains from risking their boats through mistakenly giving in to the seamen's desire to help the shipwrecked. However, some U-boat commanders still tried. The no-rescue order, 154, soon was superseded by an order so severe in its wording that it could be interpreted as a directive not only to not rescue but actually to kill. The Laconia incident apparently gave the excuse. The RMS Laconia, torpedoed on the night of 12 September 1942 by U-156, commanded by Captain Werner Hartenstein. Hartenstein spotted the Laconia 650 nautical miles from the west coast of Africa. The Laconia was technically a legitimate target, flying a British ensign and identified in the Lloyd's registry. She was carrying British soldiers and civilians, including women and children, as well as Italian prisoners of war with their Polish guards en route to Cape Town, South Africa. The patrol log of U-156 read, 2207, standing by to leeward to await sinking. 2226, during a loop to windward, heard Italian cries for help. Fished for people, Italian prisoners of war from North Africa. Ostensibly 1,200 to 1,800 of them on board. Hartenstein surfaced and heard the calls from Italians, his allies. He then saw that there were civilians on board, that it was not just a troop transport. Hartenstein disregarded the standing no rescue order and ordered his men to save as many survivors as possible. Soon, U-156 had 200 people on board the surfaced submarine, while throwing tow lines to another 200 passengers in 4 lifeboats. His crew assisted the rest, who were still in the water, focusing upon the women and children, then the Italians. Hartenstein placed a Red Cross flag over the conning tower, and he sent an open message to the Allies to organize rescue of the survivors. Hartenstein had sent the message regarding the event to Doenitz, who immediately radioed 3 other German submarines to proceed to help U-156. U-506, commanded by Erich Werdemann, and U-507, commanded by Haro Schacht. The other 2 German U-boats and an Italian submarine then joined in collecting the Italian prisoners. Hartenstein also broadcast a request for help to the British in the clear, promising not to attack any ship joining him in his rescue work. He spent the day helping survivors, both enemy and Italian, into the scattered lifeboats and providing what first aid they could. The British Royal Navy had received the message and requested an American long-range aircraft look for survivors. They also stated the U-boat was still on location. But what they did not relay to the Americans was the fact that the U-boat was conducting rescue operations trying to save lives. Doenitz radioed U-156, ordering Hartenstein to keep his boat clear for diving. The rescue work was continued for the next 2 days, with all the submarines involved, and Doenitz sent a Vichy French cruiser to assist with collecting survivors. The British had intercepted that transmission and knew that the Vichy French ship, allied to Germany, would be arriving. On 16 September, U-156 was crowded with even more survivors and towing 5 lifeboats when it was spotted by the B-24 Liberator, which circled overhead. Being limited visibility, the U-156 signaled the plane by lantern, inquiring for location of the expected French cruiser, but the aircraft came in and bombed U-156, very nearly sinking her by a close miss to her port side. Hartenstein relayed what was happening in the open and in real time. U-506 and U-507 were also soon loaded with survivors and towing lifeboats. The next day, U-506 was also attacked by a seaplane while crowded with survivors. As it has often been said, no good deed goes unpunished. Doenitz had to make a tough call, but he rejected the advice from his staff to push the survivors overboard. So he sent a radio message to U-156 to stop all rescue operations, and he later advised U-507 to cast off her tow lines to the lifeboats containing English and Poles. The next day, all submarines in the area were ordered to keep clear for crash diving, taking, quote, all measures ruthlessly, including the discontinuance of rescue. Hartenstein radioed back about the women and children clogging his deck. Doenitz's message to U-507 was, keep clear for crash diving, transfer all but Italians to lifeboats. The next day, U-507 transferred her Italians to the French cruiser and placed the English women and children in lifeboats after they spent the night on board. Hartenstein then sent a message with his update. Doenitz replied, action disapproved. Boat was sent to rescue Italians, not Englishmen and Poles. The 3 U-boat commanders had their orders: offload the Italians aboard the French ship and resume patrols. Cut the lifeboats loose and leave the area before more aircraft arrived on the scene. One British merchant officer who was wounded in the American attack remained with U-156 until it returned to port and was taken prisoner. Doenitz was impressed with the spirit of Hartenstein's humanity and awarded him the Knight's Cross. He then gave him a formal reprimand for disobeying standing orders. The Laconia incident was the one factor that changed the attitude of the German High Command, and even Hitler became involved. Several U-boat commanders had their impression of the event and the Laconia Order, as it was called. U-boat commander Admiral Erich Taub stated, the situation with Laconia sealed the fates of those on board the ships we sank. After the attack on the rescuers, it became a court-martial offense to lend any aid after sinking a ship. Admiral Reinhard Hardagen weighed in. The bombing of Hartenstein, whom I knew well, was a disastrous event. I think that all of us commanders wanted to save lives. We were simply there to sink ships, but this moment changed everything. The Laconia order was issued by Doenitz, but only after Hitler weighed in and demanded that, quote, this foolish practice must stop. According to SS Lieutenant General Karl Wolff, quote, Hitler was enraged when he learned about it. He was too angry to place the call to Doenitz himself, and he had someone else do it. I remember him saying, if a single one of my captains loses his boat due to such foolishness, he need not return to port. The order read, to all commanders, Number 1, no attempt of any kind must be made at rescuing members of ships sunk, and this includes the picking up of persons in the water and putting them in lifeboats, righting capsized lifeboats, and handing over food and water. Rescue runs counter to the rudimentary demands of warfare for the destruction of enemy ships and crews. Number 2, orders for bringing in captains and chief engineers still apply. Number 3, rescue the shipwrecked only if their statements will be of importance to your boat. Number 4, be harsh, having in mind that the enemy takes no regard for women and children in his bombing attacks on German cities. On the same date, this order is recorded in the War Diary of the Flag Officer of Submarines. Quote, the attention of commanding officers is again drawn to the fact that all efforts to rescue members of ships, of crews, which have been sunk contradict the most primitive demands for the conduct of warfare by annihilating enemy ships and their crews. Orders concerning the bringing in of captains and engineers still stand. This was the circumstance in which Doenitz found himself on trial. Under direct examination, Doenitz admitted that he prepared his U-boats in the tactics of commerce warfare under the pre-war German prize ordinance, which provided certain limitations and required the safeguarding of crews and passengers as laid down in the London Naval Treaty. The Laconia order that he issued per Hitler's order was used against Doenitz, but his defense team countered with the fact that the Allies had tried to sink submarines involved in a rescue effort in violation of the Hague Convention, the Geneva Convention of 1929, and the London Naval Treaty. The prosecution of Doenitz was led by the British, but there were several factors in the Admiral's favor. Used in his defense was the British order from the Admiralty announced on 8 May 1940, stating, all vessels should be sunk at sight in the Skagerrak. American Admiral Chester Nimitz stated as a fellow professional that unrestricted submarine warfare was carried on in the Pacific Ocean by the United States from the first day of the Pacific War. These statements of fact then played in the decision regarding Doenitz's culpability and guilt of any war crimes, and whether he breached the international law of submarine warfare. All the U-boat commanders, Erich Werdemann and Werner Hartenstein, along with their U-boats, were sunk during the war, with U-156 lost with all hands. U-506 was bombed and broke in two, 12 July 1943, and 15 men were seen in the water by the pilot, who dropped a life raft and a smoke flare. Only 6 of these men were rescued by a British destroyer 3 days later. Harro Schacht and U-507 also had Captain Heinz Radau on board as an observer. It was sunk by aircraft on 13 January 1943. There were no survivors from the entire crew of 56 men. In the end, Grand Admiral Karl Doenitz was sentenced to 10 years and was effectively a political prisoner. He died on 24 September 1980, aged 89.
Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please click like, subscribe, and share. Send us comments and show ideas, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time.